Welcome back to the war. Now you've probably heard about bombers that devastated cities, levelled armies and turned the tide of battle during World War II. But what about the ones that didn't? The planes that, despite their promises, were complete flops. In a war where success often meant life or death, there were some bombers that just didn't live up to the hype. Today, we're diving into the worst bombers used in World War II. These were the ones that couldn't deliver on their mission, or worse, doom the very pilots who flew them. So what made these bombers so terrible? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see how some of these planes almost seem designed to fail. Let's get started. The Fairey Battle. A name that should have struck fear into the hearts of the enemy, but in reality, it was more like a sitting duck. The British Fairey Battle was a light bomber designed in the early 1930s. On paper, it was supposed to be the future of light bombers. It carried a decent payload, had a sleek design, and was expected to be quick enough to avoid enemy fire. By the time the war broke out, it was already obsolete. During the Battle of France in 1940, the Fairey Battle faced its ultimate test and failed miserably. The German Luftwaffe had faster, more agile planes, and the battle just couldn't keep up. It became a slow-moving target, suffering appalling losses. Here's the thing. Some missions saw over 50% of Fairey battle crews never returning. Let that sink in. A bomber with a coin flip's chance of getting back. Not the kinds of odds you want. And yet, the Fairey Battle is not the worst bomber that we'll talk about today. The Soviet Union had its own fair share of bomber blunders. And the Petyakov PE-2 makes the list for good reason. While it was known as a fast dive bomber, it wasn't exactly loved by its pilots. Yes, it was fast, especially for a bomber, but what good is speed when you're built like a house of cards? The PE-2 was notorious for being difficult to fly and extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. Pilots often found themselves in planes riddled with bullet holes, desperately hoping they could make it back to base. PE-2 was rushed into production, which meant design flaws were patched up on the fly. Pilots joked that the PE-2 was built more for paperwork than for bombing, with endless fixes and modifications needed just to keep them in the air. But if you think flying a fragile, rushed design was bad, imagine piloting a bomber that was so heavy it was barely airworthy. Now we get to the Heinkel He 177. On paper, this plane was supposed to be Germany's answer to the heavy bombers of the Allies, like the B-17 Flying Fortress. But in reality, the Heinkel He 177 earned a chilling nickname, the Flaming Coffin. But why? The engines were so prone to overheating that many He 177s caught fire in mid-air. Imagine being a pilot soaring over enemy territory, only to have your engines burst into flames. This wasn't just a rare occurrence, either. Hundreds of He 177s were lost due to engine fires. The bomber had a twin-engine design, but the engines were coupled together, making them extremely complex and prone to mechanical failure. Even worse, the Heinkel's airframe was often too weak to handle the loads it was expected to carry. And bombs? Sure, as long as you didn't mind risking an engine fire and structural failure. But believe it or not, there's an even worse bomber on this list. How about one that couldn't even defend itself properly? Stay tuned. Next up is the Blackburn Bther, a British bomber that should never have left the drawing board. The Botha was designed to be a reconnaissance bomber, and on paper it seemed like it had promise. It was supposed to be able to bomb targets and carry out long-range reconnaissance missions, but in reality it was practically a death sentence for its crews. The main issue? It was hopelessly underpowered. The Botha's engines were so weak that the plane struggled to get off the ground, and once it was airborne, it flew like a brick. But it was also terribly unstable, making it difficult for pilots to handle. The cockpit had notoriously bad visibility, and worst of all, it had a tendency to stall during critical moments, which often resulted in fatal crashes. In fact, the Botha suffered so many accidents during training in early missions that it was quickly pulled from frontline service and relegated to second line duties. If you thought flying a plane that couldn't stay in the air was bad, wait until you hear about a bomber that was called the Widowmaker for the number of pilots it killed. Last, but certainly not least, we have the Martin B26 Marauder, a plane that was so dangerous to fly that it earned the nickname Widowmaker. The B26 was notorious for having a high takeoff and landing speed, which led to a horrifying number of crashes before the plane even made it to combat. Early models of the B26 had such a poor safety record that pilots refused to fly them, and it became common for crews to be terrified of the plane itself, not just the enemy. But it wasn't all bad news for the Marauder. After a series of modifications and improvements, it actually became a more reliable bomber later in the war. Still, its early reputation as the Widowmaker haunted it throughout the conflict, and many pilots never trusted it again. So there you have it, the worst bombers used in World War II. From the slow-moving Fairey Battle to the fiery death trap of the Heinkel He 177. These planes remind us that not every design in war is a success. But here's the irony. Despite their flaws, each one of these bombers played a role in shaping the outcome of the war. Sometimes it's the failures that teach us the most, and now, the next time you hear about the legendary bombers of World War II, you'll know which ones didn't live up to their names. Hi soldiers, thanks for watching once again. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Check back in again soon.